Imagine this. You're flying high above war-torn Europe, surrounded by nothing but the roar of your engines and the endless stretch of darkened sky. But then, something impossible happens. As you approach your target, a chilling sound breaks the silence, the sound of screams, not from below, but from the very clouds themselves. This isn't a nightmare. This is real. The bomber crews of World War II heard the screams from the clouds. But what were they? Were they the echoes of lost souls, or something far darker? Welcome to today's episode of Wartime Shadows, where the line between history and the supernatural blurs in the most chilling wartime stories ever told. Join us as we dive into the mystery behind the bombers who heard the screams from the clouds. This is not just a story of war. It's a tale of terror, mystery, and the unexplained. The Red Sky over Dresden. February 13th, 1945. The skies above Germany burned red. A squadron of Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers soared over the city of Dresden, engines roaring through the freezing night air. Below them, firestorms consumed the Baroque skyline, once called the Florence on the Elbe. The mission was clear: target the industrial zones, cripple the German war machine. But what happened in the sky that night would haunt the surviving airmen far more than anything they saw below. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Avery, a seasoned pilot with over 30 raids behind him, later described the night as the most unnatural silence he had ever heard, until it was broken. The bombing had just begun. The payloads dropped in sequence, the city beneath lighting up in a surreal canvas of orange and red. That's when it happened. Through the thick cloud cover, a sound began to emerge, something that didn't come from any aircraft, radio, or anti-aircraft fire. It was a scream, not one, but many. It began faint, like the wind howling through metal. But within seconds, it grew louder, sharper, layered with tones no human throat should make. High-pitched wails, deep guttural cries. Some of the crew thought it was the German flak guns playing tricks on their minds. Others thought it was something far worse. One of the tail gunners, Private Colin Dyer, swore he saw faces in the clouds, distorted, wide-eyed, and twisted in agony. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the shapes were still there, swirling in the smoke-choked sky. They were screaming, he recalled years later in an unpublished letter. Not in fear, but in rage, as if we had disturbed something. Even inside the cockpit, muffled through the vibration of engines and metal, the crew could hear it, shrill, soul-piercing, inhuman. The pilot asked if it could be the radio's feedback interference, but the radios were silent. As they turned to make another pass over the city, one of the rear bombers suddenly veered out of formation. The crew aboard said the pilot had frozen, staring blankly into the clouds ahead. When they managed to regain control, he wouldn't speak for hours. Eventually, he muttered, "They were there, in the sky, watching us." Back at the base in England, no one could explain what had happened. Official reports describe extreme atmospheric interference and psychological stress due to combat. But among the pilots, a different term began to circulate: the screaming sky. It was never written in the mission logs, never acknowledged by command. But within the tight circles of bomber crews, it became an unspoken truth. Something was in the clouds that night. Something ancient, something angry. And the screams, they weren't just from below. They were coming from above. The screams in the clouds. The night after Dresden, the skies remained restless. As the bombers returned to their base in Lincolnshire, many hoped the strange sounds from the clouds were nothing more than combat stress. Phantoms of the mind, born from exhaustion and fear. But the phenomenon didn't end in Dresden. In the weeks that followed, similar missions brought back similar reports. During a bombing run over Leipzig, the crew of another Lancaster reported hearing the exact same sound. Unearthly, shrill, echoing like cries from deep within the clouds. But this time, it happened before a single bomb had been dropped. Flight engineer Alan Hensley was the first to notice it. It started like a whistle, he said, like pressure leaking from the fuselage. But then it changed. It sounded like a woman screaming. Then several. Then something else entirely. He crawled toward the tail section, convinced something had come loose. What he found instead made his blood run cold. The clouds outside were thick and unnatural, almost too dense, like smoke that had a will of its own. As the searchlight swept across the gray mass, he saw something move. A shape, then another. He stared out, paralyzed. Faces, he later whispered. Hundreds of them, screaming, clawing, pressed up against the clouds like a veil of the dead. The pilot called out over the intercom, asking if anyone else had heard the noise. The silence that followed wasn't from disbelief, it was from fear. No one wanted to admit it, but they had all heard it. Some tried to rationalize it. Wind shear, interference, stress. But deep down, they knew better. The sound wasn't coming from their own minds. It was coming from outside the aircraft. The next night, over Chemnitz, another squadron reported the same phenomenon. Screams, not like anything human, emerging just as they reached bombing altitude. This time, the air grew colder inside the cabin, despite the heating systems running full. One of the gunners collapsed mid-flight, mumbling incoherently as blood dripped from his nose. Later, he claimed he had heard voices calling his name, begging him to stop. One crewman refused to fly again. He was transferred to ground duty after suffering what was officially labeled a psychological break. But in private, he told the chaplain, "They're not dead. They're still up there, trapped, and they're angry at us for what we're doing." By now, the whispers had begun to spread through the base. Pilots talked in hushed tones about the cloud people, or the whalers. Some even made small offerings before takeoff. A photo of a loved one, a pressed flower, a coin, anything to keep the voices at bay. Commanders brushed it all off, of course. Superstition, fatigue, the toll of prolonged war. But those who had flown into that cursed cloud cover knew the truth. The sky was no longer empty, and when the bombs fell, the screams didn't just come from the cities below. They came from the very heavens above. Echoes from past missions. Before Dresden, before Leipzig, there had been signs. Pilots had whispered about them for years. Strange sensations during night raids, cold spots in heated cabins, unexplained radio interference, shadows flickering across the clouds when there should have been nothing there. But they were easy to ignore, easy to explain away, until the screaming started. In the spring of 1944, during the build-up to D-Day, Flight Officer Raymond Coster flew dozens of nighttime sorties over occupied France. He was respected, efficient, and never spoke of fear. But after one particular mission targeting a munitions plant near Cannes, something changed. He returned pale and shaken, refused to eat, spoke only when spoken to. When pressed by the squadron doctor, he finally said, "They were reaching for us. From the sky. I saw them. It wasn't flak fire. It wasn't the enemy. It was something else." Coster was removed from active duty. 2 months later, he was found wandering the countryside, barefoot, muttering about voices in the smoke. Nobody took his story seriously back then. Not until the screams began to echo across multiple missions, and more experienced airmen started reporting similar things. One of them, Warrant Officer Edwin Shaw, had flown in every major bombing campaign since '42. He was known for his calm under fire. But after the Dresden raid, he opened up to a chaplain, describing an almost identical experience he'd had months earlier over Hamburg. He remembered the clouds changing, thickening in unnatural patterns. He described hearing something like 1,000 people whispering from just outside the aircraft, but when he looked out, he saw nothing but swirling blackness. It wasn't fear, he said. It was guilt. It was like the air itself was accusing us. Shaw began keeping a journal. In it, he documented moments during past raids when he and others experienced what he called spiritual resistance. His entries spoke of echoes, of shapes barely visible in the dark, of radios going dead at the exact moment bombs were released. One chilling line read, "The sky remembers what we try to forget." The uncanny experiences weren't confined to the British side. An American B-17 crew returning from a night raid over Berlin in early 1945 reported seeing red flashes in the clouds, not from anti-aircraft fire. When they passed through, every single radio on board went silent. Then, for 12 full minutes, they all heard weeping. No language, just sorrow. Loud, wet, human sobbing, as if the sky itself was mourning. As the war dragged on, The phenomenon seemed to grow, both in strength and in presence. Pilots who had flown for years without incident were suddenly plagued by dreams, shadows, and voices. They began to wonder, had the skies become haunted by the very souls their missions had helped release? Was war itself tearing a hole in something unseen, something spiritual? And if so, what had they brought down upon themselves? A mysterious radio warning. The weather was clear over Berlin, too clear. It was the night of March 18, 1945. A squadron of RAF Lancasters moved into formation, preparing for one of the final large-scale bombing runs of the war. Spirits were high. The end felt near. But for Flight Lieutenant James Mercer and his crew, this mission would become a descent into the unknown. As they reached cruising altitude, the navigator reported something odd. Their compass needle had begun to drift, erratic, twitching, unable to settle. Moments later, the onboard radio crackled to life. At first, it was static, normal. Then came the voice. Faint, distorted, German, but not a military transmission. Not from the ground. It wasn't coded or formatted. It was just a voice, desperate, trembling. Verlasst diesen Ort. Ihr bringt den Tod. Sie sind da oben. Leave this place. You bring death. They are up there. The crew looked at each other in stunned silence. No one had touched the receiver. No call sign. No frequency identification. It had simply bled through the static. The radio man, Sergeant Alan Fielding, attempted to trace the origin of the signal, but the dial spun wildly, refusing to lock on. The voice faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum, almost like breathing. Heavy, wet, mechanical, and organic all at once. Then the screams began again. Not outside, not in the clouds. This time, they came through the headset. Fielding ripped it off his head, shouting that something was whispering directly into his ears. His name, over and over, layered under dozens of other voices, male and female, young and old. Alan, you did this. In the cockpit, the pilots struggled to maintain altitude as the altimeter fluctuated wildly. The clouds ahead shifted shape unnaturally, massive forms rising in the dark, moving against the wind. Mercer stared ahead, sweat running down his temples despite the freezing temperatures. That's when the voice returned. Clear, in English now. Turn back. The entire crew heard it. No debate, no confusion. A single, chilling command, spoken in a flat, emotionless tone that came from nowhere and everywhere. Turn back. The pilot nearly did. For a moment, the aircraft banked slightly to the west. But then orders came through the official channel. Loud, clear, oblivious to whatever was happening aboard. They were to proceed. And so they did. They dropped their payload. Fire bloomed across the horizon. The earth burned. But on the return flight, the crew sat in silence. The radio remained dead. The compass frozen. And none of them ever heard that voice again. But each man agreed on one thing. It hadn't been a human voice. Not exactly. It had spoken with knowledge. With warning. With a sense of sorrow they couldn't explain. As if something in the sky had tried to stop them. Not the enemy. Not the Germans. Something else. Something watching from above the clouds, beyond the veil of war. And it had tried, one final time, to save them from themselves. Shadows in the mist. It started as a routine flight, but routine meant little in the skies over a dying Europe. 2 nights after the radio warning, a Lancaster bomber codenamed Black Swan was assigned to a midnight raid over Nuremberg. The weather reports predicted low fog across central Germany. A light mist, nothing to worry about. But what Black Swan's crew encountered was no ordinary fog. As they climbed toward altitude, the navigator noticed something off. Their course took them straight into a cloud bank that hadn't been on charts. It was thick, silver gray, strangely motionless, as if it had frozen in place between layers of the atmosphere. There was no turbulence, no wind, just stillness. The bomber entered the cloud, and then the light disappeared. Not dimmed, disappeared. Inside the fog, even the glow from the instrument panels seemed to dull. The fuselage creaked under some unseen pressure. The crew said it felt like flying through a vacuum. No air, no time, no sound. Then the shadows appeared. At first, they moved along the edge of vision, darting, slithering, circling just beyond the reach of the gunner's spotlight. They weren't birds. They weren't planes. They weren't anything the crew could define. Long, twisting forms, human-like in shape but far too tall, far too thin. Their movements weren't natural. They drifted, hovered, bent in ways no body should. Gunner Charlie Wells screamed over the intercom. He saw one pressed against the outer glass, its face barely visible through the frost. No eyes, just deep sockets. A mouth locked open in a silent, endless scream. Then it vanished. The pilot, now panicked, attempted to climb above the mist. But the fog rose with them like it was alive, gripping the wings, holding them inside. The radio went silent. The compass spun like a top, and something tapped on the hull. Repeatedly, methodically, like fingers. Tap, tap, tap. Inside the hold, one of the bombs dislodged slightly, though they hadn't hit turbulence. The bombardier lunged to secure it. As he did, he swore he felt a hand brush his neck. Cold, wet, not imagined. Finally, with engines screaming, they broke through the top of the cloud layer, and the shadows were gone. But they left something behind. Frost covered the interior windows from the inside. On the radio casing, someone, or something, had traced a single word in the condensation. Warum? What? Back on the ground, the flight report read only heavy mist, minor system failures. But the crew knew what they had seen, or at least what had seen them. None of the men on Black Swan spoke openly of the incident for years. Some never flew again. Others returned to the skies, but always with crosses around their necks, charms in their pockets, or quiet prayers whispered before takeoff. Because they knew, the mist was no ordinary weather. It was watching, and it was no longer just beneath them. It was waiting above, below, all around. The German legend of the sky wraiths. They were called Himmelsgeister, sky ghosts. Long before the war, German peasants living in the shadow of the Ur Mountains told stories about them. During thunderstorms, when lightning split the sky and thunder shook the valleys, some swore they heard something else. Screams, not from the ground, but from the clouds themselves. It was said that in times of great suffering, plague, famine, war, the skies would become a prison for restless souls. Those who died in anguish and could not find peace. They would rise with the smoke of burning cities and wander among the clouds, invisible but ever present, waiting, watching. And when the screams returned during the bombing raids of World War II, the old people of Saxony remembered. A German chaplain stationed near Dresden recounted a moment when a local farmer, eyes sunken with age and fear, approached him after the bombing. The old man clutched a rosary and in a shaking voice whispered, "They're awake again. You've woken them." When asked who, he replied simply, "The ones who scream in the sky." But this wasn't just rural superstition. In early 1945, as the Allies increased their bombing of German cities, Luftwaffe night fighter pilots began reporting strange encounters, shapes in the clouds, voices in their headsets, unexplained flashes of light. Some refused to fly. One squadron leader recorded in his log, "The fog is not natural. There are eyes in it. They watch from above." These accounts were dismissed as hallucinations, stress, fatigue. But behind closed doors, intelligence officers began to wonder, how could pilots from both sides, who never spoke or shared stories, describe the exact same phenomena? One British intelligence agent, embedded with the RAF, came across a captured German document. An unofficial memo circulated among Luftwaffe aircrew titled Begegnungen mit den Himmelsgeistern, Encounters with the Sky Spirits. It listed 17 separate accounts from German pilots who had experienced unexplained sounds, sightings, and physical phenomena in midair. What made it chilling was that several reports came from missions where no enemy aircraft were present. One pilot described being followed by a shape that looked like a human figure stretched by wind, with no eyes, only a gaping mouth, drifting silently alongside his plane for over 6 minutes. When he landed, his crew found black soot streaks across the fuselage, stains that didn't match any known material. Another pilot, after a run over Cologne, claimed he saw women floating in the sky, arms outstretched, weeping. He was later hospitalized, unfit for service, after refusing to enter any aircraft again. The stories were buried, ridiculed, or erased. But among both Allied and Axis veterans, the legend of the Himmelsgeister took root, growing in whispers long after the war ended. Were they spirits of the innocent, avenging ghosts of civilian dead? Or something even older, awakened by fire, suffering? No one knew for sure. But one thing was clear. The skies over Europe had become more than just a battlefield. They had become haunted. The secret bomber files. For decades, the official story was silence. No records, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the paranormal accounts that spread among bomber crews like wildfire during the final years of the war. But in 1978, a British researcher named Harold Penley, investigating declassified RAF archives for a book on aerial warfare, stumbled upon a file labeled only Aircrew Psychological Deviations. Night Sorties 1944 to 45. It wasn't in the main war archive. It had been tucked away in a separate cabinet, with no cross-reference in any official log. Inside were 74 pages of hand-typed reports, internal memos, and flight debriefs, all related to unusual events experienced by night bombing crews. They didn't call them ghosts. They used terms like environmental anomalies, auditory hallucinations, and collective sensory disturbances. But reading between the lines, the pattern was undeniable. One report described a bomber squadron returning from Hamburg, all 6 aircraft reporting screams heard outside the fuselage at 17,000 feet. Another noted a crew that refused to fly again after a human face was observed in the cloud cover for over 3 minutes, moving alongside the aircraft, expressionless, then vanishing. In the margins of several reports, an officer had scribbled, "Same pattern. Unseen source. External origin. Cannot explain." Then came the most disturbing entry of all. Dated April 1945, marked confidential, eyes only. A Lancaster had disappeared over Leipzig. No mayday, no enemy contact, no flak, nothing. But a nearby bomber, flying just behind the lost aircraft, recorded a final radio transmission before the signal cut. It wasn't a distress call. It was a whisper, barely audible, layered with static. Slowed down, amplified, and transcribed, the words read, "They're here. They're screaming. They're inside the plane." There was no official explanation. The case was quietly closed. Families told the bomber had been lost to technical failure. Penley, the researcher, tried to bring these findings to light. He contacted surviving airmen, historians, and even BBC journalists. But one by one, the doors shut. Editors said the story lacked credibility. Military officials refused to comment. And a month after Penley submitted a Freedom of Information request for the full file, his home was broken into. Nothing stolen, but all his notes were gone. He never pursued the matter again. But some of the surviving airmen, now elderly, long retired, did. One even mailed Penley a copy of his original flight log. In it, under the observations column, were 4 hastily scrawled words. Voices above the clouds. He added no explanation, just a date and his signature. Over time, word of the secret bomber files spread among paranormal circles. Some dismissed them as wartime stress, urban legend. But others believed this was the smoking gun. Evidence that the strange phenomena in the skies had been real. Witnessed, recorded, buried. The government never issued an official statement, but asked the men who flew those missions, who heard the screams, saw the shadows, felt the pressure of unseen hands pressing on the hull at 15,000 feet. They'll tell you, those skies weren't empty. Not then, and maybe not now. The vanishing bomber. It was supposed to be a short mission. On April 7th, 1945, with the war in Europe nearing its end, a Lancaster bomber designated K-91 Widow's Wing departed from RAF Wickenby for a final sortie over eastern Germany. Its task, reconnaissance and photographic mapping. No bombs, no combat, a simple in-and-out flight. The crew consisted of 7 men, all experienced. The weather was clear. Morale was high, but WWII never returned. There was no SOS, no enemy contact. The aircraft vanished from radar just after crossing into German airspace. Rescue planes were dispatched. Search teams combed the area for weeks. Nothing. No wreckage. No bodies. Not even a signal echo. Official records marked it as missing, presumed lost due to mechanical failure. But weeks later, something surfaced. Something inexplicable. A German civilian, sifting through rubble near Magdeburg, recovered a badly damaged flight recorder canister. Unusual because Allied reconnaissance planes typically didn't carry them. But this one did. The tape inside had partially survived. Most of the recording was silent, until the final 48 seconds. The first sound was static, thick, distorted. Then came the voices. They weren't frantic. They weren't panicked. They were whispering, indistinct. Dozens, layered together. Male and female, old and young. Not the crew. Not German. Not language, exactly. Just sound, rising, merging, growing louder. Then came a phrase, clear but unnatural, slow, drawn out. The voice didn't belong to anyone on the flight manifest. They're not gone. A sharp, metallic screech followed, as if metal was being torn open from the inside. One crewman could be heard shouting something. It's difficult to make out, but audio experts later believed he said, "They're in the walls. They're in the goddamn walls." Then silence. Not static. Total silence. The recorder was passed from German authorities to Allied investigators. It never appeared in the public records. But decades later, a retired RAF intelligence officer anonymously leaked a typed transcript, matching the audio exactly. A second copy of the tape was never found. More disturbing than the audio was what happened months later. In 1947, 2 hikers near the Austrian border stumbled upon a piece of aircraft fuselage in a remote mountain ravine. Burned, twisted, partially embedded in the cliffside, painted on the side, barely visible through the scorched metal. K-91, Widow's Wing. But here's the thing, it was thousands of kilometers off course. There were no signs of impact, no trail, and strangest of all, the metal showed no corrosion, as if it had only recently landed there. No bodies, no gear, no answers, just a single, haunting message carved into the inner wall of the wreckage. It looked like it had been scratched in with a tool or fingernails. "We never left the sky." No further evidence was found. The story was buried. But to this day, aviation enthusiasts and paranormal researchers still whisper about Widow's Wing. Not because it disappeared, but because, in some impossible way, it might still be flying. The survivors speak. They kept their silence for decades. Not out of shame, not because they were told to, but because no one would believe them. For the surviving airmen of the night bombing campaigns, the end of the war brought no peace. The medals were polished, the uniforms packed away, families were built, lives moved on, but the sky never let them forget. In the 1990s, a small group of RAF veterans began to meet privately in a pub in Lincolnshire. Most of them had flown Lancasters. Most had served in the same squadrons during the final years of the war. And all of them, without exception, had seen things they never wrote in their logbooks. One of them was Arthur Menzies, a former rear gunner. In a quiet 1998 interview, never aired publicly but later transcribed by a local historian, he described what he called the Watchers. "They weren't human," he said softly, staring at his tea. "Or maybe they were once. But whatever they are now, they live in the clouds. They see us, especially when the bombs fall." He recounted a mission over Frankfurt where he saw shapes trailing their aircraft. Not fighters, not flak, but figures. Pale, elongated. He said they had mouths open wide, but made no sound. Not then. Another veteran, Frank Heller, spoke of the screams. He hadn't heard them during flight. He heard them after, always at night, always just before he drifted to sleep. Screams not from memory, but from above, as if something was circling his home, waiting for darkness. One night, in 1952, he claimed he woke to find condensation on his bedroom window. Fingerprints, small, child-sized, on the inside of the glass. He lived alone. But perhaps the most chilling confession came from Group Captain Edward Mallory, a man known for his cold precision and decorated career. In a private letter, discovered after his death, Mallory wrote, "I always told them I was proud of my service. And I was. But in the clouds, I heard the dead. Not just the ones below. Ours too. The ones who never made it home. The ones who vanished without a trace. They scream because they're trapped between worlds. The war never ended for them, and I fear it never will." These men weren't writing horror stories. They weren't seeking fame. They spoke only when age had softened the fear of ridicule. And when they did speak, the stories echoed across time and distance. Different planes, different missions, but always the same core details. Voices in the clouds, faces in the mist, figures watching from above, and that terrible, unmistakable feeling that they were being judged, not by enemy fighters, by something older, something woven into the sky itself. Today, few of those men remain, but their stories persist, passed down in memoirs, hidden in footnotes, whispered by the children of veterans who remember waking to find their fathers sweating, screaming, and staring out the window at an empty night sky. Only it wasn't empty to them. They remembered what was up there, and they knew it was still watching. Judgment from the sky. The war ended in 1945. The bombs stopped falling. The cities began to rebuild. Soldiers returned home, some with medals, others with memories they would carry like scars. But for a certain few, the war never truly left the skies. Across Europe, legends grew quietly in the cracks left behind by history. Farmers in Germany spoke of storms that came without clouds, bringing with them the sounds of weeping from above. Night hikers in the Ardennes swore they'd heard voices whispering in the mist, calling names they'd never spoken aloud. And pilots, modern pilots, began reporting sudden system failures, cold drafts inside sealed cabins, and the occasional flicker of a face in the corner of a cloud. They called them atmospheric anomalies. But to those who knew the stories, it was something else. Judgment. Over time, the term screaming sky entered niche circles of wartime folklore. Historians dismissed it. Psychologists offered explanations, shared trauma, mass suggestion, the desperate need for meaning in a time of mass destruction. But there was one theory, quietly repeated by both believers and skeptics, that no one could quite dismiss. What if the skies record? Not like machines, not with tapes or frequencies, but with memory. What if the skies over Europe had absorbed everything, the agony, the fire, the death cries, and held on to them, echoing them back to those who dared disturb the silence again? Maybe it wasn't just about guilt. Maybe it was about consequence. One modern pilot, flying a training mission over northern France in 2003, made an anonymous post on a now-defunct aviation forum. He described a sudden chill at 12,000 feet, followed by static across all columns. Then, barely audible, he heard a voice whisper from the darkness outside the cockpit. "You've done this before." There was no one else in the sky that night. He grounded himself the next day, never flew again. A radar technician at a weather station near Berlin once said, half-jokingly, "There are places over the old bomb routes where storms form too often, like the sky's still angry." But if the sky is angry, who is it angry with? The men who followed orders? The civilians who died in fire? Or all of us for letting it happen again and again? As time marches forward and the last witnesses fade away, the screams may one day stop. Or perhaps they'll grow louder, reaching through technology, through silence, through cloud and fog and fear, waiting for the next war, waiting for the next flight. Because maybe the sky doesn't forget. Maybe it doesn't forgive. And maybe, just maybe, the screaming never really came from the clouds at all. Maybe it came from what we left behind in them. Ourselves. The war ended. But the horrors of those skies, they never truly vanished. The screams still echo. The mystery remains unsolved. And the shadows of those haunting moments linger long after the bombs fell. But one thing is certain. The skies above Europe hold secrets darker than we could ever imagine. Did the bombers hear real spirits? Or were they simply victims of war's psychological toll? Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into history. If you enjoyed this Wartime Shadows tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And remember, the past isn't always as quiet as we think. Keep your eyes on the sky, because who knows what's still watching.